Breaking news tonight.
Dramatic video, Chicago police officers with their guns drawn.
Superintendent Eddie Johnson charges that they all made false reports in the wake of the McDonald shooting.
While they may be good for journalism, they're not good for the city.
Police shot and killed O'Neill last Thursday near 74th and Merrill.
Good evening. I'm Chris Bury. Welcome to In the Loop and our continuing coverage of Chicago on the Brink. A look at the relationship between the community and law enforcement. Tonight we examine media coverage of police-involved shootings. Is it fair? Major news outlets have been criticized for not pursuing the truth behind the Laquan McDonald police shooting, raising questions about the role of the media. Tonight, 4 veteran journalists discuss how the media cover violence involving police.
There's a bias in any reporting anyone does. We all bring something to the dance, but I've always said, at least about television, that the most pronounced bias is that of the viewer. I spent 50 years in television, and I can guarantee you, at the end of one of our newscasts, no one at home ever looked up and said, "Oh my goodness, I've been wrong my whole life and Ron is right."
You know, when I think about that word bias, that's come up now because of the Laquan McDonald case and all the reporting that's been done after that shooting. Before, we were biased against who? The victim. It wasn't the police officer we were biased against. We were mostly taking what the police officer said and what we were told, and we were running with it. We were reporting it, we put it in the newspaper, we put it on air, and nobody really said, oh, you know, we're biased. And now suddenly, because we're looking at the police officers and looking at in detail and in scrutiny of these police shootings, now suddenly we, the media, are now labeled as biased toward who? The police officer.
Well, I completely agree with both parts of that. I mean, I think that for generations, we've just published the police blotter, essentially. I had a role in uncovering and beginning to bring into visibility the Laquan McDonald story, but in truth, I remember reading the story in the first 24 hours, having an uneasy feeling. Boy with a knife, you know, the responding officers had originally asked for a taser, thinking that might be the outer limits of the force they needed. 5 minutes later, he's dead. Something didn't compute on the face of it. Turned the page. So the only reason I got involved was a whistleblower within law enforcement with a tip.
I would say that, you know, at the Tribune, I'm really impressed by how much commitment there is to investigative reporting. I mean, we've done a lot of phenomenal reporting around, you know, not maybe Laquan McDonald we were trying to play catch up, but because we're putting so many resources into investigative reporting, we don't have the bodies to do the day-to-day reporting, and that's really where you are connected with communities.
We also have to recognize the realities of the media these days. There have been tremendous cutbacks over the past several years in newspapers. Eyes, ears, feet taken off the street, reporters laid off. There have been tremendous competitive pressures in the world of television to get it done faster, produce more news with fewer people. And I think in the course of that, we in the media have to recognize that in many cases, we are not able to do the job we once were able to do. We were more readily willing to accept that police spokesman's version on the street because it was just a today story.
Yeah.
Get that on, the story's over tomorrow, we're done with it.
But I think I agree with that, and we all know that that's the case, you know, in terms of a really debilitated media right now. But I think it also is a question of priorities. Now priorities have pretty dramatically shifted, but we know, and I know Angela's reporting is of this nature, it takes a lot of resources, a lot of time to learn things on the ground. Not from the press release, to learn things on the ground. And it's an investment in building the relationships that allow you to have sources. Who does that anymore?
Right, but that's true. But it almost gets down to the very nitty-gritty of how we report the news in the first place and how we're structured. Because, you know, if you think about it, a beat reporter who has to develop sources, have to go back day after day and try to get information out of the Chicago Police Department, they are really not suited to going in and raising red flags because a Pat Camden is saying over and over and over again the same thing. We didn't do it, you know. It really took, I think, this shakeup of not just the politicians, but of the media, to get us to rethink how we are reporting these stories. I went back and looked at Pat Camden, you know, how many times Pat Camden said the same thing. I was almost embarrassed.
Oh, yeah.
That, you know, we had all these stories going back to 2003, in which Pat Camden was basically saying the same thing over and over and over again. And so I think that's one, if there's any good to come out of this, it does make us think there's another way that we should be doing this. And investigative reporters, I know you can speak to this, investigative reporters are now doing much more work looking at the Chicago Police Department.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, in the future, this is really going to help in the quality of the reporting around police shootings. So, for example, in all of the police shootings that have happened in the months since we started compiling information about every police shooting in Chicago, we're able to identify who is the officer and what is their pattern. Have they been involved in other shootings? And then to match that up with other data sets, you know, that we've been looking at too, complaint history, lawsuits. So we can see, you know, is this an officer who has a lot of red flags around them or not? And, you know, really add more depth and context to the reporting.
I would throw one other thing out, which has really preoccupied me lately in continuing to report on the Laquan McDonald story. And, you know, we've recently had this series of reports that haven't been made public yet from the Inspector General looking at the individual officers. So you have the incident and, you know, the now famous video that everybody's seen multiple times. That's sort of part one of the story. But what we're dealing with now, and I think it's another kind of challenge for how we think about our role in the media, is the institutional response to what happened. And that's all about telling a story. You know, we can now definitively show that the police department, within hours of the incident, knew everything we know now about what happened. They had multiple civilian and police witnesses. They had the video. The autopsy, he was declared dead 10:45, something like that, on the night of the 20th. On the morning of the 21st at 8:30, they began the autopsy. You know, autopsies take a while to be finalized, but 16 independent gunshot wounds doesn't take long to learn. So as of the time the city was putting out a press release that basically said, you know, young man with a knife lunges at police officers and causes his own death, you know, all responsibility was on the victim, they knew everything we know now. And so the history of the months that followed before it finally came out what happened was a history of the city in every possible way doubling down on that narrative they knew to be false. And so when we talk about the code of silence, I think we're really talking about an exercise of narrative control. That's how they build the narrative, and it involves falsifying reports, destroying evidence, intimidating witnesses. All these things were in the service of a narrative that we only belatedly contested.
I think, you know, the fact that there was video of Laquan McDonald, I mean, that in all of these police shootings, that's the game changer. Right. Before you had, you know, our newsroom isn't very reflective of our city. And you have a lot of people who work in a newsroom who don't have these kind of encounters and don't see the sort of grind on the street and, you know, police-community relationships. And you're taking the official, you know, statement and, you know, you're giving police the benefit of the doubt that they're giving you the truth. And these videos have shown, and it's, you know, it's been an awakening, I think, to white America and to mainstream media, because, you know, you go out to a police shooting scene, for example, and, you know, you may have the police union spokesman saying something, you know, that's, you know, laced with hyperbole, but then you also have witnesses on the scene who say things that don't add up. You can talk to 4 people who say 4 different things. And so, you know, you're trying to assess as a reporter, you know, the who has the accurate information, who saw it.
And that's really a hard thing to do, because when you cover these stories, you're going to have the police saying the same thing over and over. It's the person had a gun, they lunged at police, they tried to run us over, that's why they got shot. But on the other side of that, you're going to have the family members and the friends on the street, and they're all going to be saying he never had a gun, he was this good kid, he never did anything wrong, So here you are stuck in the middle trying to sort it out. And the other, I think the challenge for Chicago has been the fact that when you look at this, you have the police on one side, these police shootings, but on the other side, you have so many people have been killed. Right. So many people have been, tragically murdered from shot on the street for doing nothing more than sitting on their porch or playing in their yard. And I really do believe that our resources at the time of the Laquan McDonald shooting were so stretched, our focus wasn't even on police shootings. Our focus was totally on why we have so many shootings in Chicago, why can't Rahm Emanuel do anything about it, what's with the police superintendent and the Chicago Police Department, that they can't get a handle on this crime.
I agree the video is a game changer, but it's very rare that there is video as definitive as the Laquan McDonald video. That was the very moment, it was almost like it was on graph paper because of the lines in the highway to show that he was definitively moving away from the officer who shot him, who was claiming he lunged at him. It's extraordinarily rare that you have video that's that definitive. Even something as disturbing as the recent Paul O'Neill shooting, where there's a lot to identify there that's problematic and, on the face of it, incompetent. It's still so chaotic, what's going on, and then you have partial perspectives. That will be the norm more than something as definitive as this.
Yeah, even when there is the use of police body cams, which are becoming more frequent, what I know from seeing video that's been shot in the field by professional photographers is you rarely get the whole story out of that one shot. We're going to get bits and pieces, but we're going to get more information than we ever had. One of the complaints about bias in the media in the Laquan McDonald case is we showed the shooting over and over again, and we didn't show the sequence leading up to it, which included Laquan McDonald apparently acting in a belligerent manner, moving toward officers at some point, refusing to follow any orders at all. We get all that, but when somebody complains that we didn't show all that, even though all that has been reported, that seems to be saying, well, then if we'd have showed the 30 minutes before, it was okay to shoot him 16 times? I don't buy that argument. That's not an example of bias in the media. We're going to show you the incident as it happened. In this case, there was video and there were 16 shots, and that was a wake-up call for all of us.
On the point of what led up to the police shooting, we went through and painstakingly tracked every shooting. 435 shootings with hits going back 6 years. And we found that, in a lot of these cases, if you did go back to the beginning, it was like misdemeanor sort of offenses that started these police-involved shootings. And I think that's a big question. That's where the Justice Department is going to step in and, point out some of the problems with the, some tactics for improving or lowering police shootings. They call it de-escalation. It's sort of a buzzword, but, it's not stopping a group of people on a street corner who are drinking or on a porch, and that ends with a shooting.
And that is so critical, because if you live in these communities, what you see and what the challenge is that you have people who really want to see the police step up. Yeah. They don't want people sitting on the porch publicly drinking on the corners. So the police are basically kind of trying to deal with satisfying what the community wants, what their needs are, and following the letter of the law. And I just think that the Laquan McDonald case and other cases of what I see as unjustifiable shootings or controversial shootings really leads us to the point of figuring out what is it that the media can do better going forward than they have done in the past.
If we look at a number of the famous shootings, starting with Michael Brown, they've all been trivial occasions. Jaywalking, selling loose cigarettes, broken taillight, you can extend the list. In fact, in the Laquan McDonald case, there's extraordinary footage that shows from exterior surveillance cameras that show the original responding officers, the two officers who responded, found a boy with a knife in this deserted kind of industrial landscape who was unresponsive. He wasn't aggressive, but he was kind of disassociated. They asked him to drop the knife. He didn't drop it. What those two officers did, and this is kind of dropped out of the narrative, they did exactly what we would want officers to do. Part of what's fascinating about this story is that the first half of the incident is just the kind of police work we want, where they don't muscle up, they don't put, nobody's threatened, they handle it flawlessly, and then it turns into this horrific execution.
Part of that is the question the police department has to ask itself is what lack of training leads to that moment, or what lack of awareness of an officer having an issue with anger or other personal issues, and how much of that is the department always coming together over every issue and glossing over things that should be fixed. And if you took them out of the uniform and put them in private life and a member of their family or a neighbor was having those same kinds of issues, they might talk about it, but they won't talk about it when it becomes a fellow officer.
Well, it also goes to something Angela said about the data, the information. So we had the police department and the city have all of this really precious information, much of it coming in the form of complaints from citizens who feel like they've had an abusive encounter with the police. Until recently, you know, it was an infinitesimally small percentage of those tens of thousands of complaints that ever led to any kind of discipline. So you had a system of sort of virtual impunity for abusive officers and nobody connecting the dots. Even in the case of Jason Van Dyke, the officer involved in the Laquan McDonald case, once people saw his disciplinary record and looked back, in a relatively short period, he had, in addition to other shooting episodes, a large number of excessive force, you know, always with African American victims, and often with an element of racial, racial verbal ugliness. Well, that's the sign. You could have intervened so much earlier.
And that's an example of, I think, the bias of society and the media. We've all seen those stories, we've all seen that reaction, and I think society generally, and journalists included, look at those complaints against an officer, and our first reaction is, well, yeah, bad people are going to say bad things about him because they're angry they got caught. You know, we want to, our inclination is to excuse some of those things rather than look at them more closely.
If you look closely at who are the officers who are shooting, not all of the officers who shoot the most have a lot of complaints against them. The officer who's actually shot the most over 6 years, 5 times, female tactical officer, 3 misses, 2 hits, 1 was a fatal, and the guy had a bag of marijuana. But nobody's looking at the patterns of, you know, is this an officer who is, and I'm not judging the shooting, I'm just trying to understand the shootings, that this is an officer who, you know, is maybe afraid, you know, but until you have someone who is looking at the patterns and figuring out who's in the right assignments, you know, then you're going to have, you know, deadly consequences. People who lose their lives are, you know, wounded.
All right, but to get back to the bias issue, we talked about politicians, you know, there might be political reasons why there was bias. We talked about the media and the fact that reporters may not have the kind of background or understanding, and so it's reflected in their reporting. But, you know, in covering this for 26 years, what I realized is that the whole system was biased. It's not just any of the pieces of it, the entire system from top to bottom, including the families. When you think about it, I mean, so many instances where you cannot get to prosecuting a police officer or really get to the facts of the matter because they settle the cases. The city settles the cases with the family. The family walks away with $5 million or $4 million or $3 million or whatever amount of money, and that's the end. You never hear anything else about it. And I think so when in the end, you have a problem that affects the bias affects the entire system and not just pieces of it.
I would argue the biggest, well, I don't know if bias is the right word, but the biggest challenge is the enormous power that the police union has, you know, and even like piecing together these shootings and looking for patterns in officers and why this hasn't been done historically. If you even read through police reports, like the standard forms, like the tactical response
Yep.
report, it looks like it was written by the union. It's like the victim or the offender, and it's like the officer is the victim, the offender is, and not everything is black and white. You just see the enormous power. And in other places, at least in a dozen, we did some reporting on foot chases. I don't know if you guys read this, but in at least a dozen other cities where the Justice Department has done some investigating or, opened, a probe into police department, and typically they're urban police departments. They've recommended, some pretty standard reforms on foot chases, and these were actually created by a police group like 20 years ago. The intent was to make the job safer for officers, and don't follow someone alone into a dark space, wait for backup, try to contain someone if you know who they are, just wait and get them later. Don't give up, don't let the bad guy run free, but try to surround him. But the police union is, even when it comes to reforms that are driven by police departments, they're just really reluctant.
I want to come back to just the general role of the union in all of this, because I think as you talk about this machinery, including the city law office, entering into settlements, the union so gums up investigations with various protections for its members. In a certain sense, the Fraternal Order of Police has been too successful as a union. And my colleagues and I joke, but it's really not a joke. I think it's accurate to say that police officers have more due process than any other category of citizens, including children and the mentally ill. I mean, it's an extraordinary amount of procedural protections that they have. An immediate example, as we talk about Laquan McDonald and these other shooting cases, is investigators are barred from talking to officers for the first 24 hours. Wow. Well, that's plenty of time to circle the wagons, build the narrative, make evidence disappear, as we've seen in the McDonald case, but many others. That's just one example of many. So I think there's a lot that can be accomplished by going back to the bargaining table in the present political context.
As we're sitting and talking about this, I'm thinking that we're looking at it from several different angles, from the police angle and the media angle and that of pastors and community leaders, and how do we deal with all this. And that's the part that gets me down, actually, is that there aren't any easy answers here. And it's not just the police, it's not just the media, it's not just families, it's not just education, it's not just the support system. And how do you get all those pieces finally put back together in some cohesive form? One of my greatest concerns about the city of Chicago is that for many, many years, a tremendous percentage of African American males who graduated from 8th grade did not graduate from high school. For many, many years, that number ran as high as 40, and I'm told in some years 50%. And so we were turning out and disenfranchising young black males to a degree that gangs were almost the only option. And now the gang structure is broken down to the point where the hierarchies aren't in charge anymore. Any two 13-year-olds can get their hands on a gun, and once two of them are together with a gun, they're a gang, and they're going to do things nobody ever thought possible in this city before. And that scares me.
I want to get back to what we were talking about with this bias in the media and us only showing certain parts, like, running the shooting of Laquan McDonald, the actual moment. All of that. Well, now newspapers are competing with online sites. They're competing with organizations like yours, in which you're able to focus and narrow your focus down to this one thing, and therefore drill really deeply down into it. Competing with that for major newspapers is going to be very, very difficult. And I think we're going to see more and more publications just doing that. You know what I'm saying? This issue is so huge that I can see publications just devoted and websites just devoted to dealing with the whole police shootings and police relations between African American community and the police department. Because people want to see the whole thing. They don't. If we say in the media, if we think that people just don't trust the police officers, we're wrong on that. They don't trust us either.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, they think we did a terrible job, and that's the reason why we didn't get to the Laquan McDonald shooting before you got to the Laquan McDonald shooting. They think that we have that we're not honest in our reporting. I hear that all the time, and even when I write about racial inequalities, you would not believe the amount of hate mail I get for just pointing out the obvious.
Yeah.
I mean, this is not groundbreaking.
I know.
I'm not doing any investigative reporting. I'm just putting the facts right in front of your face, and they don't want to hear it.
And I think there is talk about how far do we move toward a world of citizen journalists who will take an individual focus. We've always had people, for example, court watchers, who on their own would go sit in courtrooms and watch, and they had an interest, and they would sometimes have a relationship with a reporter. They would tip us off to things going on in a courtroom that we wouldn't normally cover, wouldn't normally see. Now you have citizen journalists with access to video on which they can blog and disseminate in any manner and variety of ways, but we're left with the essential question that we're facing now with the media. Who do you trust, and how and when?
Yeah, and I think you're also, you know, Angela and I have been part of this sort of percolating of things in the media. I mean, there's a lot of turbulence over the last decade plus, and different kinds of startups and strategies. I think it's beginning, at least from our perspective, beginning to sort itself out somewhat, so that an entity like ours that you know, finds capacity, staff, funding to go deep, as Mary said, and it can also work with the Sun-Times in an ongoing collaborative way. We get the benefit of your delivery system. You get the benefit of our capacity to go deep into a story that people care about. I think there's a lot of that beginning to happen, but it's been a rough period.
Well, all that works,
Yeah.
because we can sit here and say, you did good work, you have some resume, we've seen it, we like what you did, and we're going to trust that you're going to continue in that way. But there are others like you who can develop resources, and they may have a strict political agenda, for example, in which they're trying to find their way into the media, and it's not going to be easy.
No, it's tough, and I take Mary's point about just the crisis of legitimacy of all sorts of institutions. I mean, our public and civic institutions, you know, starting with the police, but extending to the criminal justice system, the fifth floor of City Hall, but also where we sit. I think we're in an extraordinary moment where I would describe it as a crisis of the civic order, really. You know, the whole nature of our contract as citizens within the city. And on one hand, we have opportunities I really never expected to see in my lifetime for significant and really deep and enduring reforms. On the other hand, there are whole areas of the city that are close to being like a failed state. And how we navigate this moment, I mean, this goes back to your sense of alarm, really. How, you know, there's possibility, but it's coupled with great danger, and it all arises out of the same circumstances. These aren't two separate things.
I have a great sense of alarm of where we stand in society now and how we work this out. Strangely, I can find a moment of comfort in the fact that I was a reporter in San Francisco in the late 60s and early 70s, when times were troubling nationwide. There were riots in the streets, there were riots on college campuses. We didn't know whether the fabric of society was going to stay together or not. And somehow we found a way to get through it. And that's sort of where I come down with what's going on now. It will be painful, and I can still hope that somehow we find a way to get through it.
New technology and the surge in social media mean more ordinary citizens have the tools to report and publish on their own. So in covering stories such as police shootings, everyone is a journalist. Thanks for tuning in to this week's special presentation of Chicago on the Brink, a look at the relationship between the community and law enforcement. Next week, part 4, hear from Chicago pastors discussing the role of churches. To watch more from tonight's discussion, look on WYCC.org and click on In the Loop. Until next week, I'm Chris Bury.